So tell us your name.
Judy Hogan.
And what was your life like before you got involved in the women's movement?
Well, unlike many women whom I got to know later, I had never felt like being a woman was going to stop me or hinder me in any way. And from age 7, I became socially aware. My mother, however, who influenced me a lot in my childhood, had been in the university in the 30s and was part of that earlier women's movement. And for instance, they had many organizations in her college that fostered women. But at 7, I was in bed with rheumatic fever, and I learned to write little stories. I was schooled at home. And my mother was the secretary of the YWCA on the University of Oklahoma campus. But Norman, where the university was a sundown town, and Negroes, as they were called then, could not stay in town after dark. And there was no place for them to get a drink of water or go to the bathroom. So she brought 2 Negro women from Oklahoma College, black college, home at lunchtime so they could use the bathroom. And when they left to go back to the meeting, I asked her why she had brought them home, and she said, because they could only go to the bathroom in a home. And I was very shocked, and I said, "That's bad, that's terrible." And my mother said, "Well, you can write to the mayor." And I did, and we sent the letter. Don't think he paid much attention, but and as time went on, I became even more interested in what happened to black people. We lived in Jacksonville, Florida for a while. And the Urban League my father was part of had to talk secretly about how to help the black people toward justice. And then finally, we didn't really have black people near us in Jacksonville or Norman. But when I went to college, the University of Oklahoma started my freshman year. We had the first black student there, a woman. And I got acquainted with her, and I also belonged to the YMCA, YWCA. And as a result of that...
What is the YWCA? What is the YWCA? What does that stand for?
Women's... Young Women's Christian Association. And YMCA was Young Men's Christian Association. Actually, my grandfather had gone to China with the Young Men's Christian Association. And Mother was always active in it. So I went to several regional conferences with them. And then I went to the national conference in Miami, Ohio. No, it's Miami University in Ohio. And there I was an officer, and some of us stayed over. And I fell in love with a young black man from Virginia, from Petersburg, and Virginia State, yeah.
What year was this around?
By then it was 1957.
Thank you.
And it was after the Supreme Court desegregation in 54, but the whole South was in turmoil, people trying to stop the integration of schools and the integration of lunch counters and so forth. In 1960, they had the Woolworths lunch counter sit-downs in Greensboro, but even in the late 50s, there was a lot going on, and eventually John Crawley said that he would give me up because it was too difficult to live in the South as an interracial couple. And by then, being thick article, I had fallen in love with somebody else. So, but I had a good academic career, and then I left for New York City. I wanted to be a writer, and then I went to Indiana University with a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, and not too many women had those. But love was more on my mind than classics and literature at that point. So I left. I didn't finish all my classes in the spring of that year. One professor told me that a steamroller was going to roll over me. I says, it's the first time I had that. Later, when I was fighting corruption in the Chatham Commissioners, somebody else told me the steamroller was going to get me. But so far, I haven't been steamrolled. Yeah, I did after leaving Indiana University. Then in 1964, I went out to Berkeley, and I got a job typing, and I had a little girl by then. I was divorced from my first husband. And there was a lot of unrest around the voting situation for blacks in the South, and a lot of the Berkeley students had been there, so they had a protest, and they wanted me not to go to class. They had been sitting on the steps of the administration building, and they were carried out and put in jail and so forth. But I wanted to go to class, and I did. My friends were much more worried about all these things than I was when I was trying to get a PhD. But at Berkeley, I did slowly get, I guess, radicalized, because I saw a tear gas squad forming to go back and tear gas all the kids in downtown Berkeley, around the campus. And from Berkeley we went to, I had a new husband, we went to Evanston, Illinois. And there was unrest on these campuses back then, and finally Northwestern had it, and we lived across the street, so remember I took coffee down to the kids who were protesting. Then I ended up in North Carolina, and after a short time I got divorced again and lived in subsidized housing for poor people in a largely black complex. It was integrated. We were only one of two white families. I learned a lot more then about what black people go through on their home base. A lot of them were not happy to see me. And some of their kids were very hard on my son Tim. But then I was doing a magazine, Hyperion, a poetry magazine, with a friend who was in Berkeley. And we were publishing anti-war poetry. But along about 1973, we went to the National Convention of Small Presses and Small Magazines in New Orleans. I mean, the whole family went. I now had 3 kids and a husband, and we camped. We camped across the bayou from New Orleans in a campground that had mosquitoes so bad that when we got home we had to dive into our tent or we'd be eaten alive. But that's when I met my first feminists. They were starting to be active in the country in the early 70s or late 60s, but I didn't feel that I was really part of that. I had never felt the need of a special organization to fight for my rights. But I learned when I went to the conference that the feminists had already been pushing for babysitting help and a separate meeting for all the women. And they were extremely supportive of me with my baby. I had a baby.
So you were sort of a natural feminist, but 1973 was sort of your introduction into that as
feminists who were like publishing. There was KNOW in Pittsburgh and Ann Pride. who was a leading feminist and also a leading publisher. There was a librarian from Brooklyn and some other people who were pushing the feminist agenda in this National Small Press Association. And they were very supportive of me. They held my baby during a poetry reading. They were just supportive, and so I made good friends, particularly with Anne Pride. And when we all got back home, Anne Pride published reviews that I wrote in her little magazine. And she had a book called I'm Running Away from Home, but I'm Afraid to Cross the Street, or something like that. Yeah, I became good friends with some of the feminists out there around the country. Then in 1974, we had another COSMET meeting on the West Coast, and I had run for office. We had 7 people, and the one who got the most votes from all these small presses was the chair. And I came in 3rd. And the first person who came in, the one who got the most votes, he did not want, we were starting to try to get more organized as small presses with distribution. But some of the guys who just wanted to, share stories, they weren't really interested in getting organized. This one, his name was Bennett, he walked out before the meeting was over. And the next guy who came in 2nd, he said he was going to Europe that year. So that left me. And I met with 2 other women. I think Anne Pride was one of them. I believe she was on the board too. Anyway, 3 women, and to see what we could do on the board about distribution. And the men, at least some of the men, were quite shaken that we had a separate meeting. And they called us a feminist conspiracy.
Wow.
Anyway, they had to get the votes of some other people on the board, but I ended up being the chairperson, which was not easy because there was one guy who wrote me such hostile letters I used to let them sit and steam a while before I opened them. Al Winans was his name. And at one point in one letter he said that I was like Hitler. If you get power, absolute power corrupts, and power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
You thought you were too powerful. Yikes.
Yeah, well, I didn't like to be called Hitler, but anyway, I pretty much ignored him as much as I could. When he came to meetings, he took tranquilizers, but when he got home, he let it go in his letters.
Oh.
We had a midwinter meeting in Durham. I was living near Durham, and the 7 board members and our staff person came. It went fine, really. I guess he was on tranquilizers. But in the meantime, we did get us a grant to do a distribution, to buy a vehicle to do distribution. So we bought an old library van, which came from Minnesota and was, which we didn't know, absolutely worn out. Mm-hmm. So we got we got a driver and sent him to truck driving school, and we got this thing, got him to drive it, and the first thing that happened was that the engine went out. I used to go to the Carver post office to get mechanic consultation. I remember once asking the postmaster if you're driving along and there's black smoke coming out of your engine, what does that mean?
Oh my
It
goodness.
means you burned up the engine.
So this bus was specifically for delivering small press publications?
Yeah, all over the country.
And the small presses were to publish underheard voices or just
Well, it was what they already had in print. They were
Okay.
sending us the books, and we loaded, and we got it painted, a beautiful blue, Carolina blue, and the Cosmet book van. And then
And Cosmap Mac is the
Cosmet
map.
was a small committee of small magazine editors and publishers,
Thank you.
Cosmet. And it was all ready to go and beautiful, and then the engine and the postmaster helped me understand that it was not my fault or the driver's fault. It was the truck company. So I had to go over to the truck company and argue, and they are used to having a 35-year-old woman argue with them. So we finally did get the truck. I mean, the brakes went, everything went. We finally got it running, and another driver, the first one, got tired and quit. Got it to Charleston, the Spoleto Festival, and that was it. So our attempt at distribution didn't work very well.
And did that lead up to the Carolina Wren Press?
Oh yeah, I was working on the magazine with my friend Paul Foreman.
And that's Hyperion magazine.
Hyperion.
Hyperion, and that
Poetry
was
Journal.
and that was underheard voices, as I recall. You were feminists, or there were feminist poets being published, or
Well, we published a lot of women, and what Paul and I decided was that if he really liked a poem by a man, and I didn't get it, he'd have the right to publish it. And if I had a poem by a woman that I got and he didn't, then I could.
yes, a good agreement.
Yeah, but then he was starting to publish books with an offset press, which I helped buy. But about 1976, he suggested I start my own press because I was in a different part of the country. And I don't think he always agreed with what I sent him to publish. But several of the writers here got published by him. Anyway, so I started publishing, and one of my first published books was by Jackie Shelton Green, a black poet in Orange County, whom I had met back in 1973. And now she's the North Carolina State Poet Laureate, which goes for about 3 years.
And you were her first publisher.
She brought me her poems. She says she brought them in a paper bag. I don't remember the paper bag, faintly maybe, but I remember that the poems were very, very strong, very good, very powerful, and very shocking. The one that especially struck me begins, "The moon is a rapist peeing in my window." It wasn't hard to get a whole book of Jackie's poetry, and which she called Dead on Arrival, because she was afraid that when she finally got published that nobody would be interested. But it turned out to be different. So she has now won. She's in the North Carolina Hall of Fame, and she's won the Governor's Award, and now she's the Poet Laureate. And I'm very proud of her.
So when you were starting this press and you published Jackie, you were also publishing a lot of writers, underheard voices, and
Yes, well, at the time I came to North Carolina, we moved here in 71. There was a kind of clique of people who were in the know about poetry. You got praised, you got reviewed. And I started reviewing some of those books for the newspaper, the Durham newspaper. And they took to me because I was a reviewer. But I didn't know anything about poetry in the schools. And Jackie's husband at that time said we should go to Raleigh because there was a meeting about poetry in the schools. And they hadn't invited us. he was a poet too. So we went, and in this room, in the Department of Public Instruction, were about 10 people, most of whom I had already published in Hyperion. And they gave me such hateful looks. My goodness. And I was quite shaken. I had never gotten that much direct hostility from a group of people. But I did get an offer to teach poetry in the schools not too long after that. Only the lady advised me, don't read them any of your prison poets.
Oh, wow.
Because I was corresponding with prisoners. It was something the small magazines were doing. And one of them was T.J. Reddy, who had been imprisoned for something he did not do in the 70s. And I wrote a review of him. It was published in the Durham paper saying that he was a saint. He was in prison for something he didn't do, but he was trying to be a good model for the other prisoners, doing yoga and meditation and art as well as he could. As a result, too, of that review, my husband and I and 3 kids got thrown out of our rented house in Orange County because they were probably Ku Klux Klan. They were pretty hostile to any mixing with blacks. And we'd been friendly with their hands who were black. And this was the last straw, I guess, saying that a black man was a saint.
Right.
But I became known pretty well through the state, especially in the central part of the state, the Triangle region we call it, for being a woman editor, sole proprietor of this, though I did get nonprofit status for it, this publishing company. We ended Hyperion about 1980, but the last one I edited, or next to last one I edited, was the women's issue. And I had been also, in those 70s, I had been setting up women's readings in a counterculture restaurant in Durham called Sometime. And we had quite a few of those readings, and new women writers were coming out of the woodwork. And so I collected their poems, and I also was at a writers' conference up in Washington State about 76, I think. And I got women up there to send me poems, but it took me until 79 to get that issue out. I called it Black Sun, New Moon. I did about 30 or 33 books under Carolina Wren, many women writers, but I was publishing people who were not part of this original clique, and a playwright and a Greek immigrant woman and poets. So I think I published about 5 or 6 books by black authors, but I think I published more than that by women authors. And then about 86, there was a collective in Chapel Hill called Lollipop Power, which was dedicated to publishing children's books that were multiracial and non-sexist. And they wanted to quit, but they had to give they were a nonprofit, they had to give their assets to me. They didn't have much money, but they had the books. And we published one new title called The Boy Toy after we took it over. I found a writer to help me who could also earn a little money, but there wasn't much money to earn. I was then also offered to be affiliate of the Durham Arts Council, and I got an office space in the new building. And they wanted me because I was a black publisher.
Or a publisher of black writers.
Yes. By the 80s, North Carolina was beginning to try to catch up nationally with what they were supposed to be doing with blacks, and I got grants from the North Carolina Arts Council, partly because I was publishing black writers.
Right.
So all that ground shifted. Then in the early 80s, starting about 83, we had a new governor who had promised one of his financial people to give more money for literature. So literature was given $200,000 instead of a puny amount. And they did set up small press grants. Plus, we decided to start a statewide network. We called it the North Carolina Writers Network. And we were able to get a grant from the National Endowment because one of the people who was part of my feminist conspiracy, Mary MacArthur, was the acting head of the literature department. So I went up there with George Ann Eubanks, who was part of the new organization. And Mary was fine with our getting a grant. If the national gave us so much for the salary and then the state gave us so much for the salary, then we could start employing somebody and gradually take over the costs over 3 years. Yeah. They would pay some each year, but less, and we had to pay more. Yeah. And that actually got off the ground in 1984, and I was the leader on that, the chair of the steering committee, and then I was chair of the organization, and I was very clever. I worked to get all those little cliques from all over the state to be on the board. And we went for diversity. And I felt good about that. And then I left that. I left Carolina Wren in 91.
Was that around when you did the Tell Me a Story That's True?
Oh yeah, in 91, I also had gotten the interest of Duke University in collecting my papers in Carolina Wren papers because I was this lone woman publisher, and I raised hell quite a bit too. You know, I wasn't especially always thinking about women's issues, but I was always thinking about justice. So between them, I tried to get a grant to publish 2 books, both by women. One was a nonfiction book and one was a book of poetry. And the North Carolina Arts Council said they couldn't do nonfiction, even though the national literature was doing nonfiction, creative nonfiction. So since we couldn't get a grant, we decided to hold a conference, get a grant for the conference, and use that money to publish.
Wonderful.
And we got a grant from the Mary Duke Biddle Foundation. Mrs. Siemens was always very good to me in those days. And we drew, it was free. It was held at a black university in Durham. And they provided a bag lunch or something for $5.
Was that North Carolina Central?
Yeah, North Carolina Central. And we drew 600 women from all over the state.
Wow.
And I told them that their writing was important. By then I had read Writing a Woman's Life. And she talks about how many women's stories are not in books, how they accomplished things, how they led different lives. So Carolyn Howard, that was it.
Yes.
In fact, she actually came and met with our board that was going to have this conference. She wasn't a bit interested in me. She was only interested in the ones that were trying to believe in themselves.
Mm, yeah.
But see, I already did, so I was dull. But it was amazing. We got the women's studies people from Duke, from UNC, University of North Carolina, from the black colleges. We did oral narratives and diary, journal.
And this is for the Tell Me a Story That's True?
Yeah, we called it Tell Me a Story That's True. And we made a t-shirt with Muriel Rukeyser's words, which has been a motto for me too. If any woman ever told the whole story of her life, the world would split open. It hasn't yet.
And I don't know if you want to go into the Russia
Oh,
just
yeah.
as a little interim?
And when I left Carolina Wren to other people in 91, other people decided they would help take it over. And in 1990, spring of 1990, I had a letter from a Russian writer who was the head of his organization through a sister cities connection in Kostromar, Russia, Mikhail Bazenkov. And he invited me to come to Russia and do an exchange, a writer exchange through sister cities, Durham and Kostromar. So I actually went for the first time in 1990, and we found that we had written some letters, and we found a lot in common. He was beginning, because under Gorbachev things had loosened some, so he was beginning to publish locally, try to get his writers into little newspapers around the area. And he was very interested in my publishing. And he was very charming, and I fell in love with him, which was not in the plan, since he had a wife. But the wife managed it very well, and I don't think he told her the whole story either. But I said, you must be ready to get your husband back, or something like that. And she said, oh, it's been very awakening, very enlightening. You know, she thought it was great. And then we wrote to each other, and then he came to visit me alone, because he couldn't, I finally got enough money to get him over here, but he couldn't bring anybody else, because about 1992, 91, 92, not only had Russia been through an attempt to have a coup take over, which they stopped, but their economy was blasted. And so I got him, he knew no English. His only English was, can you help me? Or will you help me? Yeah. Anyway, Delta Airlines got him to Raleigh-Durham, and I got him. And then I took him to, he was a fan of Faulkner, so I took him to Oxford, Mississippi, to see the Faulkner Museum and talk to someone who knew Faulkner. And we worked together really well as a team. But one of the interesting things about knowing him and other men in Russia that I got to know, and women, was that at that time, Russian women were quite overworked. They did all the homework, all the cooking and shopping, which often means standing in line, and they also often went out to work, whether they were teaching or working in offices or cleaning streets. And feminism had been strong at the beginning of the revolution, back in 1917, but it was pretty weak.
By 1991, when you were there?
I didn't go in 91,
Oh.
I went in 90.
Oh, okay.
And then in 92, I actually stayed in people's homes. So I learned more about their relationship as far as sharing the homework. And one of the men I got to know, who was a university teacher, he did things for his wife, like wash dishes or shop. But Mikhail did not do anything at home. And Mikhail at times had a little trouble with me, who was kind of strong-minded.
Right.
But what he worked out was, when I was in Russia, I had to obey him.
Oh.
When he was over here, he had to obey me. And sometimes, I remember we were at one dinner. I planned a lot of dinners to save money, but I never told him why. But he said, too many meetings, and so we were not even completely finished dinner, and he wanted to leave. I said, no, we can't leave. And
so you had to manage him.
I had to manage him,
Yes.
but he let me. He let me
Yes.
manage him.
Yeah. But that was a very fruitful, the Sister Cities, and you produced a book from that, or several books,
Yeah.
volumes
In
of
fact,
poetry.
today I finally got the first copies of the first book about my Russian experiences, called Baba Summer, Part 1, about that first journey of mine, a lot of the letters that I wrote then to both men and women. And I wrote to, I made good friends with several women. And then his first visit to North Carolina.
And then after that, you moved to Moncure at some point, still with that all going on, and
Yeah.
I think we're up to the point of how your involvement in being an activist and being involved in the women's
Right.
movement.
Yeah, finally by 1998, I had saved enough money to buy a house. So I spent 1998 looking for land and looking for a pretty inexpensive way of having my own home. I had always been renting. And I finally found a lot in Moncure, which is about 25 miles south of Chapel Hill and also of Durham and also of Raleigh. And I taught in Durham, and I have a lot of friends in Chapel Hill. So but unfortunately there was a low-level nuclear dump planned for Moncure. And I decided I would buy the place because it was $35,000, which I could afford. Then it wasn't finished, so I'd have to, get the inside finished. But I would work against the low-level dump. Well, I hadn't really been especially an environmentalist until then, but I've been pretty much involved in literary and artistic politics and Sister Cities stuff, but not fighting about pollution. We did stop. They had already been fighting 10 years when I got here, but I wrote letters and I tried to help. That we did stop that low-level nuclear dump. And then several attempts were made to put landfills here. And somebody else led that, but I worked for that too.
Nuclear landfills or regular
No,
landfills?
just regular landfills. But they would have been bringing trash from all over the South.
Mm.
The nuclear thing would have brought nuclear waste from all over the South. And then we were getting nuclear rods shipped through Moncure, so I worked against that. And we got that stopped, at least they said they were stopping. The local power company has changed several times. It was CP&L, Carolina Power and Light, when I moved here, and then it became Progress Energy, and now it's all Duke Energy.
And perhaps it's important to say a little bit about the demographic of Moncure.
Moncure is, it's changed since I moved here, but when I moved here it was about 40% black, and it went back into land grants because it's the beginning of the Cape Fear River is here that flows down to the coast in Wilmington. And most of the folks here were working class and not rich. A few more rich people have moved in, people who can buy a 5-acre lot on the Haw River. And the dam that dams the Haw River, Jordan Dam, is about 2 miles away from me. And but most of the people in Moncure, the black churches had been working against that low-level dump, and another environmental organization, North Carolina Warren. But there were other people in Moncure, white people, who did not want to work with me in the beginning. I moved into a black neighborhood, and I was accepted almost immediately, but the whites took longer. But they eventually accepted me too. I mean, I was working for everyone's benefit. Finally, it began to dawn.
Yeah.
I still am, actually, because after we did, and then we had the air pollution. We had a particle board plant that was putting out more formaldehyde out of its stacks than any other such plant in the country.
Before the EPA had any controls?
Yeah. Anyway, eventually they had to, because they were polluting so bad, they had to put in new equipment, and the company that owned it sold it, and then the new people put in new equipment. And then people stopped getting asthma and bronchitis, and I had more colds too in that period.
Yeah.
And then we went to local elections. I worked to get into new people in 2004, and then I continued to work into 2006 till we got 5 really good commissioners that weren't letting in every single development. But I was kind of sick of politics by then.
And yet you were also involved in fracking?
Yeah, then I was going to quit all this activism. Then fracking came along as a threat. We had a governor who really wanted to frack, though there's not much gas here. But the gas that there was here was under Jordan Lake, under me, under Lee County nearby. We're just half a mile from Lee County. And I got to know the people in Lee County working. And I put up signs and I got petitions. And I worked with the Haw River people. And that finally got stuck in court. So then, no sooner had that slowed down than coal ash came along.
And you're still leading that coalition.
Yeah, Chatham Citizens Against Coal Ash Dump was started in late 2014. And they had made the law so that the local commissioners could do nothing. Though they could have joined our court case, but they didn't want to. So instead, they made a deal with Duke Energy, who was wanting to distribute their coal ash here, to get $19 million in return for 12 million tons of coal ash. So we took them to court, and we've done a lot of things to try to stop it.
And that fight is continuing on.
Yeah, and right now, they have stopped, they say, with 7 million tons. And we're pretty sure it's leaking already into the river and the groundwater. And we're in mediation with them, but I'm not real confident that that will work. It's really hard for corporations to think of human beings as dying. All around the state with these coal ash ponds, people have been dying.
Yeah.
And they're starting to die here. So you can't always prove it was the coal ash, but added to all the other pollution over the years, probably is.
It's really important work. So all of your long life, from age 7 to 9, I mean, you've been a lifelong activist in many different ways, and throughout all of that activism, I just want to bring in for a moment, I wasn't thinking about this earlier, but throughout all of it, you've been writing poetry and Penny Reaver mysteries. You've been writing mystery novels, and your most. I would like to just bring in your copy of Baba Summer, and let's just.
Yeah.
I think we should conclude with a little bit about all that you've been writing.
Yeah, I do write all the time.
Yes, and you've produced many fine volumes of poetry and
Okay,
mysteries.
so this is the book that tells about my first trip to Russia and Mikhail's first trip to America. He was very unimpressed with our television, by the way. And I've managed to get several poetry books published by other presses. And my mysteries were first published by a small press, and then she didn't want to do it anymore. She said she wasn't getting rich enough, so I just started doing them myself. And I have readers, not hordes yet, but I've now got 10.
And then here's one of your Penny Weaver Mysteries.
Yeah, this was based on teaching at the Black College, which I did for 3 years. And
And here's a volume of poetry.
yeah, this poetry, this river, was written when I was in love with Mikhail in the early days. I think it was the first poem that was all for him. Written when I got back from my first trip there. And
It's my favorite of your volumes of poetry.
I think it's my best in print.
It's beautiful. I think it's phenomenal. All the things that you've done activist-wise and writing-wise. And you've been a writing teacher. You've
Yeah, I
mentored
teach
through the
too.
libraries. We didn't talk at all about...
Oh yeah, I did a program in the 80s from 81 through 89 in the Durham Library and also the Burlington Library after a while. I called it A Roadmap to Good Literature for New Writers.
Action.
I realized that reading good literature was the best way to get new writers to write well. And they read. The National Humanities people at first didn't believe that my students, who were, some only finished high school and some were like doctors and nurses and stuff, but they'd never really done literature. They didn't believe my students would read Proust and Henry James. Well, they probably all didn't read Henry James. I gave a party for those that succeeded in reading Henry James' novel. But I had those who you wouldn't have expected use a Proust simile. And so they rejected a national grant. I'd gotten grants from the North Carolina Humanities. And I told my helper, Mary Little Siemens, that the national people rejected me. And she said, "That's wrong." And I learned later she went to a lady who sat on the council, the National Humanities Council, and told her they made a mistake. She said, "Send it in again." So I did. And a proposal to the National Endowment for the Humanities Library Program was about, 100 pages long. I mean,
Wow.
it was a chore. But I did get the grant, and I had to have an English teacher to listen, to come and evaluate me. And I got a really nice English teacher, and he gave me much praise at the end. By that time, Durham Arts Council was angry at me because I was always trying to change them. And their director was especially angry. And then I sent them in this letter from Townsend Leadington about what a good job I did teaching. And then they changed their tune. That's really interesting when you can get the big guys
To change.
out of their persecution
Yeah.
into praise.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard, I guess, for, someone comes in and sees something a little bit wrong and tries to change it. They don't want to change. But you were always finding something that needed changing and then getting to work on it.
Well, I've managed quite a bit of mischief.
Yes, you have. You have managed quite a bit of mischief, indeed.
Yeah.
So
I can laugh now, but there were some moments that were, I got so, like when I couldn't get the grant to do this nonfiction book, it would feel like a sock in the stomach, But I learned not to spend too much time on mooning, but to go ahead and see what I could do. I'm 80, almost 82 in May this year, and I've been slowed down by my body. He likes to rest more than I do. But I still really enjoy teaching, and I really enjoy getting to know people and seeing what we can do to make life better. So I'm glad for all the mischief. It did change things. And I don't think Jackie would have become the poet laureate if I hadn't been mischief making all along.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. and she's doing a stupendous job.
And now she's mischief making in a really wonderful way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good
Yeah.
mentoring. Anything you want to add to this
Um,
story, interview? Anything we've forgotten to
Well,
touch
for
on?
me, I guess my motto has kind of been, I have a deep intuition that guides me, and I try to do what it says. And I sort of work from the inside out, I guess. And people respond if you're genuine. Some people hate you, and some people love me. I usually get both.
Right.
But I try not to pay too much attention to those that hate me. And mostly they leave me alone. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you have done a lot of wonderful things.
Oh.
So, and you still are.